Donald Trump and everybody at the top of his administration knows full well what the Russian demands are. And the fact that Trump has said, and others have said, that a deal can be worked out means that we know what those demands are, and we're going to meet those demands, period. End of story. And this includes this crazy idea of peacekeepers and security guarantees and so forth and so on, has made it unequivocally clear that that's unacceptable, and Trump has de facto accepted that. Now, that's the private discourse that takes place behind closed doors. I think when you look at the administration and you look at what's going on in the foreign policy realm, you have to distinguish between what's happening behind closed doors, the actual decision-making process, and what's happening out in public. And let's start with regard to what's happening behind closed doors. Then there's the public debate. And the public debate is sort of a wild and crazy one, in large part because Trump is free to say whatever he wants, and because he likes to pontificate on a daily basis, and he doesn't pay much attention to facts, and he's not very careful with his language, we end up in all these debates about what he really means, and is he contradicting himself, and so forth and so on. I've gotten to the point where I just don't pay that much attention to what he says in public. The question is, what are they saying in private? And I believe in private, they know what has to be said. They have already said it at least once to the Russians, and now the details have to be worked out. The great fear here is that we're going to pull out of Europe. I mean, if you really think about what's going on here, it just shows you how bizarre these public debates are. The Europeans are greatly fearful that we're leaving the continent. We're not going to put troops in Ukraine. He has made it clear, Trump, that there is going to be no American security guarantee. He said that in public. And if there's going to be no security guarantee, there are going to be no troops in Ukraine. So this is not a serious issue. And by the way, there are not going to be British and French troops in Ukraine either. There are not going to be any troops from the West physically located in Ukraine, because if they're put there, the Russians will target them and kill them. In my recent trip to Europe and just reading the media and talking to all sorts of European friends, I think the Russophobia there is about at the same level as it is here. I think it's worst in Britain of all the European countries. I think Britain is right up there with us at the top of the ladder, but it's profound all across Europe. I think what they wanted to do is see if they could convince him to change his tune on Ukraine, to sort of act like a softer version of Joe Biden, number one. And number two, if that doesn't work, they want to do everything they can to kiss up to him, to make sure that he's not so angry or so contemptuous of them that he pulls American forces out of Europe. I think that's basically what they're doing. And I think they know that they're doomed on the Ukraine front, that Trump is not going to change his mind, and he's going to do everything he can to accommodate the Russians so that he can work out a deal over Ukraine. I think the big problem for Trump moving forward, and here we're talking mainly about Ukraine, is not the Russians. I think the big problem is the Europeans. And an even bigger problem is the Ukrainians. And the fact is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians do not want to cut a deal with Putin. And the deal that Trump appears to be working out is one that is antithetical to them. I think that he understands that Putin is a tough customer. I think he understands that Putin is in the driver's seat. And I think he understands that he's going to have to accommodate the Russians in large part if he wants to get a deal over Ukraine. So the question is, let's assume that Putin and Trump work out a deal. What happens then with the Ukrainians and the Europeans? I think probably Trump can coerce the Europeans. He has a lot of cards to play with the Europeans. They're not playing a powerful hand, and he can get them on board. But the Ukrainians are a different matter. It'd be very difficult to get them to accept the parameters of the deal that appears to be on the table. Well, the counter to that is that the Europeans will pick up the slack. And if you believe the Europeans cannot pick up the slack and that the United States will have coercive leverage over the Europeans, and I believe those two things, then the Ukrainians are pretty much on their own. And the Ukrainians on their own up against the Russians, it's really Bambi versus Godzilla. But the best solution is to create a neutral Ukraine that doesn't threaten Russia, and then have Ukraine do everything it can to have decent relations with Russia. But the number of people who make that argument are very small, and it's an argument that's been very hard to sell. I think it's an argument that Trump and his lieutenants have bought onto. I think they agree with us. But again, they may get that deal with the Russians, but the question is, can you get the Ukrainians and the Europeans on board? But what Trump wants to do is shut down the war as soon as possible. And that is in Ukraine's interest. It's not in Ukraine's interest to continue this war. And although Zelensky thinks that's the case, he's just dead wrong. He has no real option here other than to go along with what President Trump wants. And as you and I have said on countless occasions, actually what Trump wants is what's best for Ukraine. Zelensky doesn't realize that, and most Ukrainians don't realize that. So in a very important way, I think that what Trump wants to do is good for Ukraine. He's made it very clear that Ukraine cannot be in NATO, and there's nothing that Zelensky can do to change that. Whether Zelensky came to Washington and behaved much the way Starmer and Macron did, or whether he behaved the way he actually did today, it just doesn't matter. Let's face it, he's between a rock and a hard place. He's the head of a country that is in the process of being destroyed. He has no way to fix the problem. And he's, I think, just frustrated beyond belief. And that was reflected in his performance today. Again, it wasn't a smart way to behave, for sure. But in a certain way, I can understand his frustration. Playing nice with Trump and Vance is not going to solve his problem, or at least it's not going to end up producing the result he wants, which is continuation of the war and support for the United States, from the United States for that enterprise. That's what he wants. What Zelensky wants is possible to get from the United States at this point in time, period. End of story. There's no way that we can turn this one around so that Ukraine wins. Joe Biden did everything he could to help the Ukrainians. And when Joe Biden left office, the Ukrainians were losing and the Russians were on the march. And there's no evidence that we have any way of altering the balance of power on the battlefield. One is that Trump is deadly serious about putting an end to this war, improving relations with Putin and with the Russians more generally. Number two, you do not want to underestimate the amount of contempt that Trump has for the Europeans. And you also don't want to underestimate how anxious he is to greatly reduce, if not eliminate, our commitment to Europe. He basically thinks that NATO belongs in a museum, that it's not useful anymore. So if he had a serious opportunity to pull the United States out of Europe, or at least American troops out of Europe, he might just jump at it. There are three big issues here. One is that Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral state. It can't be in NATO. There can be no Western security guarantees, which basically add up to de facto membership in NATO. Ukraine has to be NATO. Ukraine has to be neutral. That's point number one. Point two is that the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed those 4 oblasts, plus that's non-negotiable. And then you have the demilitarization point, which is non-negotiable. There may be some minor changes on whether they can have 85,000 troops or 90,000 troops, who knows? But that's just minutia. You want to remember that the demilitarization issue was one of the issues that was discussed in the Istanbul Agreement. or Istanbul negotiations back in March, April 2022. So this is not new. And I believe that the Ukrainians had accepted the fact that they would have to demilitarize to the point where they did not present an offensive threat to Russia. So that issue is an old one. It's certainly still on the table. And the Russians are not going to compromise on that issue. The fact is that the Russians have a handful of demands that are non-negotiable. They have made that clear since June 14th of 2024, when those demands were clearly laid out by Putin. Now, General Keene's basic argument is that we can get the Russians to bend because we're in the driver's seat and it's them, the Russians, who are in trouble. This is delusional. The Russians are in the driver's seat. The Ukrainians are in desperate straits. And we are fed up with this war and we want to walk away from it. So Putin is the one who has all the leverage. So I think you're going to get the deal that Putin has basically articulated on June 14th and on a number of other occasions moving forward. And I think that Trump must understand very clearly what the Russian demands are, the main demands that I just described, and that he must have conveyed to the Russians that we will accept those demands. Otherwise, there's no point in Trump continuing to negotiate with Putin and continuing to talk as if we can cut a deal. So I think what Macron, Starmer, and other Europeans are doing is being very nice to President Trump and telling him that they will make certain concessions here and there.